Hello and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Andrea Renee Knits, and I'm going to answer some questions, mostly based on knitting. And today I'm wearing my Douglas Cardi with a hand-sewn top. I believe this is the peplum top from Peppermint Magazine. Yeah, there we go. The Douglas Cardi is a kind of big, oversized grandpa style drop shoulder cardigan with these fantastic pockets, knit up in DK Tuku wool and named after my father, Douglas. All right, let's get started. So question number 1. I knit the first sleeve for a sweater and it's very fitted. I'm not sure if I like the tight fit or if I should frog the sleeve and redo it in the next size up needle. Next needle size up. There we go. Can you wet block a sweater in progress, just the sleeve, to see how it fits? And if I don't like the fit after wet blocking, can I frog it then, or is it too late? I want to get the first sleeve right before starting the second sleeve. I'm also nervous about frogging back to the armhole. I'm afraid I'll mess the whole thing up. So, let's kind of break this down question by question. I would definitely listen to that little voice in your head. If that sleeve is already feeling pretty snug, it's only going to loosen up so much with blocking depending on what your yarn content is like and what the spin on that is like. But I would say if you're already kind of questioning it, I would definitely not ignore that little voice, because it's those kinds of things that can keep us from wearing the sweater when we're all done with it. Because if it's not comfortable, you're not going to reach for it. So you can wet block a sweater in progress. Wet blocking just the sleeve, I think if I were going to attempt to do that, I would just maybe try and do a steam block. So you can use the steam function on an iron, or I just purchased a while ago a little handheld steamer. I don't think it was very pricey. I think it was probably in the $20 range. So if it's something you would utilize in your knitting, or in general, if you've got long curtains you need to steam from time to time, then it might be a handy purchase. But I would try just steam blocking out that sleeve and kind of try it on and see how it feels. Otherwise, if you wanted to wet block the whole garment before finishing it, I would just throw it onto some waste yarn and wet block it and let it dry. I've definitely done that. So you shouldn't have any issues doing that. Yes, you can absolutely frog after wet blocking. I have mentioned on here before, I once knit a sweater that I wore for like a week. I kept kind of trying it out with different outfits, and I just realized I wasn't loving how it fit me. And I knew that I would not wear it, and I had used some favorite yarn to knit it up. So I unraveled it. I like to then soak the yarn. I've talked about this in a previous episode, but if you can put that yarn back into a loop to soak it, you want to tie it with some figure-8 ties to keep it from getting tangled in the bath, but that'll kind of help get the kinks out. So yeah, you can absolutely unravel that sleeve. You could even try not washing that yarn if you're going to reknit it right away. But some people would argue with that and say you should get those kinks out first. But you could try knitting it and kind of see how it feels for you. And I want to get the first sleeve. I definitely think you're on the right track getting that first sleeve exactly how you want it before continuing on, because that way you could just relax during the second sleeve. I always think of my first sleeve or my first sock as the one I have to pay attention to, and then I can just kind of use that as my guide when I'm knitting the second one, and it's much more relaxing for the second one. But I would say, I have a feeling if you already feel like the fit is tight, I personally would rather have a sleeve that's just like a little too loose than a little too tight, depending on the style of the sweater. But I just find that it can be really uncomfortable if it's a little too snug. I will say, depending on the fiber content, a lot of yarns will loosen up as you wear them too, like not even just with blocking, but as you wear, and like, you know, where we have pointy little odds and ends like our elbows and stuff like that, that can also like stretch out the sleeve a little bit. So just all things to consider, but good luck. Please let us know how it goes. Okay. My question is related to color work. Despite being careful, I always get that part more tight and inflexible. Any tricks? So I am going to link below. I did a video a couple years ago showing how I like to tension for color work to try and avoid too tight floats. I tend to go Elizabeth Zimmerman style in having, I'd rather have my floats be too loose than too tight, because I find that with blocking and wear, things kind of shimmy into where they need to be, but if it's too tight, it's just too tight. So that being said, if that tensioning trick, which for me is basically I just spread out the stitches on my right hand needle so that as I'm knitting, they're already spread out as far as they would ever need to be. So then my float is the length it needs to be at like maximum spread, stretch, whatever. But if that's not working for you, then I would go up a needle size. So most people do knit their color work tighter than the rest of their fabric. So if you're doing a sweater or a project that just has a little bit of color work, like let's say a color work yoke, a lot of people find that their tension over the yoke is much tighter than say the rest of that stockinette stitch body. So that's when I would use two different needle sizes. I'd go up a size for the color work and then back down to my regular size for the body. And I hope one of those works for you. Next question. All right, I have been binge watching your videos while knitting and sewing. Yay, I hope they're keeping you company. And one thing I've heard you mention a few times is the difference between worsted spun and woolen spun yarns. However, from looking at my stash, it doesn't seem like this is something that is clarified on yarn labels. How do you tell which way a yarn has been spun? Is this mostly just relevant for hand spun yarns, or is this a distinction for commercial yarns as well? I haven't delved into the world of hand spun yet, though hearing you talk about them makes me want to. Yay! But I'm wondering if this is something I should take into consideration when shopping commercial yarns. So I definitely think it is a powerful bit of information to have, specifically because if you are buying yarn that you are going to substitute in for a sweater, let's say I designed a sweater using woolen spun yarn and you choose to use a worsted spun yarn instead, which is super common. My sweater is going to weigh significantly less than yours because of the air that's in a woolen spun yarn. So that can make substitutions a little tricky when you might look and be like, wait, if you were going by weight, you wouldn't have enough of your worsted spun yarn. So I do find that in general, when you're gonna see it on a label, it's pretty much, if it's been spun woolen, is when you're gonna see that noted on a label. I also recommend looking at, if you're shopping online, look at those yarn descriptions, because that's also where they might have it listed how that yarn was spun. I do think that when it's worsted spun, people kind of treat that as the default. So if nothing's listed, that would probably be my assumption. Visually though, you can learn over time how to tell how that yarn was spun. So I grabbed a couple examples. This is Brooklyn Tweed, which is a yarn that a lot of people are pretty familiar with, and their Shelter, Loft, and Quarry are all woolen spun yarns. I grabbed Quarry thinking it's bulky and that will be easier for you to see, but I'm realizing that it's also single ply. So I don't know. Well, we'll try. Okay, so here is a woolen spun yarn. If you can kind of see, it is a little rougher. It's not going to be super smooth. And if I kind of tease it open, I don't know why I'm doing that in the middle of the strand. Let's do this at the end where it doesn't matter. This actually does almost look like it has plies now that I'm opening it. Maybe this is plied. Maybe this is a 3-ply yarn. Sorry, should have done my homework. I don't have the label because this is left over from a sweater I knit my daughter years and years ago. So I just went and grabbed it from like my little bin of yarns. But you can just, I don't know if you can tell how like airy it is. It's a little nubby. It's gonna pull apart easier. Do you see that? So this woolen spun yarn has air in it. I knit my sweater, a husband, out of a, did I just say that backward? My sweater, a husband. I knit my sweater, a husband. I'm so sweet to my sweaters. I knit my husband a sweater. Woo! Out of a woolen spun yarn, and he absolutely adored it because it kept him so warm. So that's woolen spun. Little rougher, not as smooth, tends to have a more matte appearance, less shine or sheen, and it's really, really, really lightweight. Now here, I used this for a recent tutorial, but here is a worsted spun yarn. I'm so far back, it's a little hard for me to see how well this is showing up for y'all, but if you can see, this yarn is really, really smooth. I think it's kind of easier to see it in the ball. It's really smooth. It's got a little bit of shine, a little bit of sheen to it. That is also just going to depend on what your yarn's made of, like the fiber content. But you can see those plies in there are pretty distinct because the yarn is so smooth. Let me find an end to this yarn. Yeah, I mean, look at, you can see where I've started to pull it apart. Do you see how like smooth and distinct that ply is compared to the woolen spun ones? So all that to say, I recommend over time, I think that if you get some of each, you'll be able to visually start seeing, oh, I think this is a woolen spun. I think this is a worsted spun. Worsted, again, it's not going to be quite as warm as a woolen spun because of that insulation factor of the air that's trapped in a woolen spun. But it's going to be a little more hard wearing because those plies are going to be a little bit stronger. So other ways, again, look at yarn descriptions if you're shopping online, and if you are shopping in your local yarn store, you can ask the people who work there because I bet they'll know and be able to point you in the right direction. All right. Design question. I've been researching different fabrics for a sweater I'm going to make for my husband. I'm curious about the differences between brioche, fisherman's rib, and twisted, half-twisted rib. Some sources seem to indicate brioche and fisherman's rib are basically the same thing, but I know you use both in your patterns. What would make you choose one over the other, and what kind of attributes do they have compared to one another in terms of the fabric they produce? So I agree with, I'm looking around, what's this? This is half fisherman's rib. That's what I did my little tutorial on. So brioche and not half, but regular fisherman's rib are basically exactly the same in the finished fabric in regards to like the physicality of that fabric. So basically what happens in fisherman's rib is you knit into the stitch below, and when you do that, it pulls up so that it almost creates this double stitch that's then worked, and that's what creates this really dense, squishy ribbed fabric. When you are doing brioche, instead, you actually wrap a little yarn over shawl around your stitches to get that same dense, squishy rib. The reason I choose one over the other in my patterns, there's a couple different things going into that choice. Brioche, I'm going to choose if I am focusing heavily on color. I think you have more freedom with brioche when using multiple colors in a project than you do with fisherman's rib. Also, if I want to play around with shaping, brioche, faux cables, lace, things like that, I prefer to do it in brioche. With fisherman's rib, I don't feel that the same amount of artistry is there. as there is with the brioche. Brioche, I think, can be, sometimes people find half, or I'm just going to take the half out of it, Fisherman's Rib, whether it be half or full. I think sometimes people find it a little less intimidating because you're just knitting into the stitch below. So it's not, you're not wrapping these little yarn overs and stuff. So I think that this can be a good stepping stone into full-on brioche. But that being said, I think brioche has a more relaxing rhythm once you get the hang of it. I think brioche has this like really nice rhythm that you get into when you're knitting it that reminds me of like when you first really get into knitting and it clicks and your hands just kind of take over and your brain can go wander and it's just so satisfying. Brioche has that same thing, where half Fisherman's Rib or Fisherman's Rib I find just is always a little bit, takes you out of the flow. So I use both, I enjoy both, but for different reasons. Twisted rib, totally different thing. So all twisted rib is knitting into the back loop of either your knit stitches or your purl stitches or both, every row, every other row, which all of those will kind of make it look a little bit different depending on how much twisting you do. But all you're doing is twisting your stitches, which kind of makes the ribbing stand out in higher relief. But that is going to be a tighter, thinner fabric than something like brioche. Brioche is basically a double fabric. So it uses up a lot more yarn. It has a lot of horizontal spread. So it's, I think of it as like an accordion. But I love it. So I love all forms of ribbing. I think that it just can look so beautiful and timeless in garments. So no matter what you choose for your husband's sweater, I'm sure it'll look fabulous. So it's really going to come down to your personal preference and what you want that fabric to do. I think that twisted rib's going to be a sturdier, stiffer fabric, while something like Fisherman's Rib or brioche, again, it kind of wants to expand, so there's a good chance it could have more drape. It's going to be warmer, squishier, use up more yarn. So I would just do some swatching and see what you prefer. All right, I think this is the last question. I'm always amazed and delighted by how you put colors together. Thank you so much. Do you have some governing principles you follow? Is it best to choose similar shades, such as shades of green in your original shifty, or select by cool versus warm tones? I find that even when my choices look great sitting next to each other in cakes, once I start knitting, they end up being muddled or clashing, especially for two-color brioche. So this just popped into my head because I've seen it happen a lot in my brioche classes. I kind of wonder when you get some muddying, if you are picking a solid yarn and a variegated yarn that look great next to each other, and then once you start knitting with them, they get lost in each other. When I've seen this happen is when they look so different, skeined up or caked up next to each other. But once you start knitting them, the variegated yarn will have a color that matches that solid, and it gets lost. You can't really see the difference, and it's amazing how much that changes as you're knitting it up. So that's just a thought that maybe that could be happening for you. But so I used to be super scared of picking my own colors. I would try to get my older sister to help me because she's just fabulous with that. And so I really just had to kind of keep pushing myself to playing around. The first time I kind of got out of my color comfort zone was with my Brioche Alicious shawl, which uses, it's basically a soft white, but then I did bands of jewel toned brioche. And for me, those jewel tones were like totally outside of my comfort zone. If you followed my work for the past, I think I put that shawl out 5 years ago. I have obviously gotten much more comfortable with color. Color is my happy place. That is what I want to play with. But it's just been a journey of trying things out. And I absolutely have had what you've experienced, where I had picked out all these colors. They looked so beautiful in skeins next to each other. And then I started knitting it and I did not like it. But that can also be how we're choosing to combine those colors. Like for me, I was using stripes and I just did not like it. Now, if I revisited those colors, they might be really beautiful together with color blocking, which would kind of keep them more separated, similar to how they were in the skeins. Maybe even playing around with brioche, or maybe not using all of them together. But as far as governing principles, I've talked about this before. I tend to begin with whatever color brings me the most joy in that moment. So I will stand in front of my yarn, I'll look around, and I'll ask myself, like, okay, if you could knit with any of these right now, what one would make you the happiest? And so I start with that. And then from there, if I'm doing a multicolor project, which most of the time I am, it is pretty rare for me to use one color in a project, just because that is where I find joy. That is what makes me excited about what I'm knitting. A lot of times is bringing different colors together. So then what I would do is I would look at that color I've chosen, and if it does have any color variation within the skein, that's where I'm gonna start. So for instance, this is a mint skein that I used recently in a shawl pattern that's coming out soon. But if I was just starting with this color, I would look at those gold specks in there, those ochre specks, and I would probably start looking at some of my other mustard yellow ochre shaded yarns. Like I'm just looking at my pencil, my little pen pouch right here. But I just want to show you now, like, see how sweet those would be together? And you already know, like the dyer's already done some of that work for you, because that's what they used to speckle this yarn with. So you could already see that they look great together. So that is someplace I start, whether it be a speckled yarn or a variegated yarn. I kind of look within and say, okay, what other colors am I seeing in here that I could make shine by bringing more of that color in with my other color choices? I also have this taped to my wall. Let's hope I don't tear it. I do think it's helpful to start with a color wheel in the beginning to give you some ideas if you are totally new to color. My favorite thing to do is called, I think they even have it on here. I believe it's just called split complementary. But one way that I like to think about it is start with a color you love. Because let's say you're starting from scratch. Let's say, I must have this taped somewhere that's keeping this from spinning. Let's say that you know that you want to do something with blue. Oh, there we go. I found it. I found where it was taped. So one of my absolute favorite color combos is blue and orange, but I don't necessarily want like primary blue with secondary orange. I want to go a little bit off of that. So what I would do is, you can see that these are complementary colors, and instead of staying directly across your color wheel, you could then go to one side. So let's say I want to use this turquoisey. This is where I'm going to hang out here. Then I would actually go, instead of directly across from it, I would go over one notch and kind of start playing with those colors. And I think that's where you can get some really unexpected color combinations, like really fun color pops, is just by start with your complementary colors, but then kind of, instead of going straight across from each other, go off to the side a little bit, use a different shade, and just see what you like. But I do promise that the more you do it, the easier it gets and the more fun it gets, because you're going to grow your confidence in picking colors, and then it's just like a whole new world. I will spare you all from singing a whole new world, but I highly recommend it. So yeah, that's how I kind of think about color, what makes me happy, and go from there. All right, well, I think that is it for today. We had a long episode last week, so I'm going to keep this one to the usual 5, but I will link the Douglas Cardi in the notes below. You can also find a link to my newsletter. Lately, I have been sneaking in some flash sales that have been like 50% off of some of my patterns, so I highly recommend signing up for my newsletter if you like to grab some fun patterns at a big discount. And there's also the link to ask questions below. There's a link to the DRK March to May knit along, which we are through our first month, but we've still got 2 months left, so there's still plenty of time to join. We're doing sweaters and shawls. There's 2 different forums just so you can kind of they get pretty chatty, so I'm trying to keep them organized as best I can. But yeah, I guess that's it. I hope you have a fabulous weekend. I hope you get to do some making or baking or tea sipping or wandering outdoors. I'm gonna see some family, so I'm super stoked for that, and I'll see you back here next week. Bye.